The hand surfaced 3 weeks before anyone thought to look for it. Marshall Calhoun Briggs had ridden the North Rimrock Trail a dozen times since the thaw began, counting the dead, mapping the wreckage, trying to write a report that would make sense to people in Cheyenne who had never seen a Wyoming mountain swallow an entire settlement whole. He had found 14 bodies so far scattered across the half-mile between the remains of Ashworth Flats and the tree line, each one telling the same wordless story of someone who had decided to walk somewhere and run out of time. This one was different. The others had fallen face forward the way exhausted people fall, arms reaching. This one's hand pointed upward, fingers slightly curled as if the man had been trying to flag down a passing rider in his final moments, as if he still believed even then that help was coming from the direction of other people. Briggs dismounted. He stood over the hand for a long time, the spring mud soft under his boots, the snow melt running in cold threads around the protruding knuckles. Behind him to the south, the ruins of Ashworth Flats caught the afternoon sun, twisted steel shattered glass, buried under dirty ice, the remnants of $180,000 worth of certainty. In front of him, to the north, a column of smoke thin as a thread rose from behind the tree line. It had been rising every morning since his team first reached this valley. Someone had kept a fire burning through the worst winter Wyoming territory had recorded in 40 years. He had met that someone 3 days ago. He had not yet found the words to put her in a report. He pulled a small leather notebook from his coat pocket. On the first page, he had written a single name, Vesper Calloway. Beneath it, a question he had not answered yet. How does a 15-year-old girl know what 60 adults refuse to believe? He remounted. He turned north toward the smoke. 7 months earlier, the Absaroka Range had been the most beautiful thing most of those 60 people had ever seen. Cornelius Ashworth had chosen this valley with the same precision he brought to everything the surveys had taken 2 years, the land acquisition, another 18 months, the engineering drawings, a full winter of evenings in his Philadelphia study with 3 different architects and a civil engineer who specialized in municipal heating systems. He was 52 years old. He had sold his controlling interest in a northern branch of the Union Pacific for more money than most men see in 3 lifetimes. And he had concluded that the logical next ambition was to build a place where intelligent people could live as they were meant to live, free of the compromises that cities demanded, sustained by the resources that modern engineering could extract from even the most demanding terrain. He called it Ashworth Flat Settlement. He did not consider this arrogant. He considered it thorough. The settlement occupied 40 acres on a natural plateau between 2 ridge lines sheltered from the prevailing western wind by a granite escarpment and fed by a creek that ran clean and fast year-round. The centerpiece was the greenhouse complex, 2 large structures of steel-frame glass shipped up from Pittsburgh in crates, each one capable of sustaining vegetables through a Wyoming winter, using the residual heat from the central boiler system. The boiler itself was the crown jewel, a coal-fired apparatus that fed hot water through a network of copper pipes running beneath the floors of every residential building on the property, turning the whole settlement into one interconnected organism of warmth. The residential houses were Victorian in style, built from timber milled in Oregon and freighted in by wagon with wide windows on every south-facing wall to take advantage of winter sun. The great hall at the center served as dining room meeting space and social hub open concept, high-ceilinged with a fireplace wide enough to roast an elk that was in practice decorative, chosen for its proportions rather than its output. 60 people lived within those 40 acres as of August 1886. They had come from Philadelphia, from Boston, from Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh, and New York. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, educators, the kind of people who had succeeded enough in the world as it was to be able to imagine a better version of it. They believed in Cornelius Ashworth's vision, the way people believe in things that cost them something, to believe with the particular fervor of those who have placed their whole hand on the table. They had given up houses in good neighborhoods, proximity to family, the small daily securities of established life, and in exchange they had received the mountains, the clean air, the philosophical satisfaction of intentional living, and the reassurance that the best engineering money could buy stood between them and whatever the wilderness might attempt. Vesper Calloway was not one of them. She had come to Ashworth Flats the way flotsam comes to shore, carried by events not intention. Her father, Josiah Calloway, had been living in a small cabin at the edge of the settlement's northern property line for 6 years before Cornelius Ashworth's people ever arrived doing the work he had always done, tracking weather patterns across the Absaroka Range, guiding the occasional hunting party through the high country, and filling notebook after notebook with barometric readings, animal observations, and the kind of slow, patient meteorological data that no university would have funded, but that Josiah considered the only honest way to understand a mountain. He had learned the trade during 4 years with the Army Signal Corps, where his job had been to keep weather records at a forward observation post in Virginia. He had survived 2 winters in a tent in the Shenandoah Valley by paying attention to things his commanding officers considered beneath their notice. He had spent the 30 years since applying the same attention to Wyoming, and Wyoming had taught him things in return. Josiah Calloway died in the spring of 1884 from a lung infection that had been working on him for 2 winters. He was 51 years old. Vesper was 13. She had no other family within 400 miles, no money, no legal standing of any kind. The Ashworth Flats settlement accepted her with a collective benevolence of people who are fundamentally decent, but also fundamentally busy. They gave her a cot in the storage room behind the Great Hall, assigned her chores that could be traded for meals, and proceeded to think of her the way one thinks of a piece of furniture that has always been in a room present, functional, and not particularly in need of attention. What they did not think about was the crate under her cot. It held 4 almanacs spanning the years 1840 through 1875, 18 years of her father's weather journals, a barometer and a mahogany case with a small crack along the left edge where Josiah had dropped it in the field and repaired it with pine resin, and a dog-eared Signal Corps field manual from 1864 that smelled permanently of Virginia clay. Vesper read these materials the way other 15-year-olds read novels, not as instruction, but as story, as the record of a specific intelligence encountering a specific landscape over decades of patient observation. She had been reading them since she was 8 years old. By the time she was 15, she knew her father's handwriting well enough to hear his voice in every entry, and she knew the Absaroka Range well enough to notice when it began behaving differently. The first anomaly appeared in the second week of August. She found the caterpillar near the creek on the underside of a flat rock she had turned over while checking the water level. It was a woolly bear, the species that local farmers and ranchers consulted with the same casual faith they applied to church attendance, and it was entirely black. Not predominantly black, not mostly black, with a thin brown band that typically wrapped its midsection like a belt. Black from end to end uniform, and absolute the color of river bottom silt at midnight. She held it on her palm for a long moment. In her father's journal from October 1856, he had written about finding 12 such caterpillars in a single afternoon. All black, no banding whatsoever. I've noted this 3 times in 20 years. Each previous occurrence preceded a winter of extraordinary severity. The winter of 1856 killed 1/3 of the cattle in this county. He had underlined the next sentence twice. The caterpillar doesn't cause the winter, it reads it. There's a difference. Vesper returned the caterpillar to the rock. She went back to the cabin, opened the current journal to a fresh page, and wrote the date, the location, and a single line, all black, no banding. Over the next 3 weeks, the evidence accumulated with the patient insistence of things that are not trying to convince anyone of anything, but simply are. The lodgepole pines along the north slope were producing sap 2 months early, thick and dark, the trees apparently concluding that there was something worth sealing against. The elk herd that grazed the upper meadow through September most years had moved down the mountain in the third week of August, 17 days ahead of any schedule Josiah had ever recorded. A colony of yellow jackets near the eastern fence line had built their paper nest. Not in the low shrubs where they typically constructed it, but 20 feet up in the fork of a tall spruce, a height that implied, if Josiah's 30-year pattern of observation was accurate, an expectation of snowpack deep enough to threaten a ground-level structure. Vesper spent her evenings with the barometer. The readings were irregular in a way that made her throat tighten, not the smooth seasonal decline of a normal autumn, but a pattern of sharp drops followed by partial recoveries that her father's journal identified as the signature of a blocking pressure system forming over the Pacific. When such a system established itself, it acted as a wall, deflecting the jet stream southward and opening a corridor for Arctic air to move directly into the northern Rockies without the moderating influence that typically blunted such intrusions. Josiah had documented this phenomenon 4 times in his career. He had called it, in the Signal Corps shorthand he never entirely abandoned, the northern breathing, the mountains drawing in a breath so deep that when they finally exhaled, everything in the valley below went white. On the 2nd of September, Vesper opened her journal to a new page. She wrote the date. She wrote the barometric readings for the past 3 weeks. She wrote the caterpillar observation, the elk movement, the wasp nest elevation, the sap density. She wrote a summary assessment in the clipped factual style her father had used when the data pointed clearly in one direction. Pattern consistent with major Arctic intrusion, likely November onset. Severity indicators exceed any previous record in this journal. Settlement infrastructure not designed for extreme cold events of this magnitude. Copper pipe network will fail below -30 degrees. Glass greenhouse structures will not sustain snow loads above threshold. Central boiler system presents single point of failure for entire thermal network. She paused. She looked at what she had written. She added one more line. They will die if they don't prepare. I cannot save all of them. I can only save myself. She stared at the last sentence for a long time. Then she drew a single firm line through it. She did not rewrite it. She left the crossing out visible because she had not yet decided whether the sentence was true or just the thing a person thinks when they are 15 years old and have spent their whole life being the person in the room that other people look through. The monthly settlement meeting was held on the 14th of September in the Great Hall. Percy Duggan had set up the lampstands himself, as he always did, because Percy had served with the 2nd Indiana Infantry through 3 years of the war and still defaulted to making himself useful before anyone asked. He was 45 broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been made for a harder life than the one he was currently living. He had come to Ashworth Flats 4 years ago as agricultural director, which was a title that meant he oversaw the kitchen gardens and the greenhouse planting schedules, and occasionally mediated disputes between community members about whose turn it was to clean the tool shed. He was good at it. He liked the work, liked the mountains, liked the sense of something being built. He was not, in September of 1886, the kind of man who questioned things that appeared to be working. He was midway through his quarterly report on the kitchen garden yields a good autumn. The tomatoes had come in strong. The root vegetables were exceptional when the girl stood up. Vesper was sitting at the end of the back bench as she always did, in the position that allowed her to leave without disrupting anyone. She had her father's journals under her arm. When she rose, the room did not immediately quiet. There were 50-odd adults in the space, and the social weight of a teenage girl standing in the back did not automatically command attention. Percy stopped talking. The room noticed. The silence spread. "We need to reinforce the greenhouse roofs." Her voice carried better than most people expected. It had a quality her fathers had possessed, not loud but precise, each word placed with intention. "We need to bring timber down from the upper slope for backup fuel. The boiler system will fail if the ambient temperature drops below -30 degrees for more than 48 hours, and it will drop below -30. We need to establish an alternative heating plan before November." The murmur that moved through the room was the specific murmur of people who have been interrupted in the middle of something pleasant by something they would prefer not to hear. Cornelius Ashworth rose from his chair at the head table with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had chaired a great many meetings and knew that the first response to a disruption determined the entire tenor of what followed. "Vesper." His tone carried the particular warmth of someone who has decided in advance to be patient. "We appreciate your concern, truly, but the boiler system was engineered for this climate by a firm that has installed similar systems in mining operations across Colorado and Montana. The copper pipe network runs 4 feet below the frost line. The greenhouses are rated for a snow load of... The copper will contract at -30. Her voice didn't rise, but it also didn't yield. She was holding the journal open. "My father measured the ground temperature at 48 inches depth during the winter of 1856. It reached -12 degrees. The frost line here is not a protection against an event of this magnitude. The boiler pumps use an oil-based lubricant that loses viscosity below -25. When the pump slows, the water in the lines cools. When the water in the lines cools, it freezes. When it freezes, the pipes burst. The entire heating network fails simultaneously." She turned a page. "The greenhouse frames are rated for 60 pounds per square foot of snow load. If this winter follows the pattern in these journals, we could see accumulation exceeding 140 pounds per square foot. The frames will buckle." The silence that followed was different from the first one. It had a self-conscious quality, the silence of people who are not certain whether they are watching something important or something embarrassing. Eugenia Marsh, who taught the settlement's children their letters and arithmetic, and who had in another life taught at a girls' academy in Boston, spoke in the careful tone of someone trying to smooth a difficult social moment without taking sides. "Vesper, the Farmer's Almanac for this year predicts a winter of moderate severity. I understand you've been concerned, but perhaps the almanac is wrong." There was nothing dramatic in how she said it. It was the flattest possible statement of the flattest possible fact. The almanac works from averages. What is coming is not average. Look at the elk. They moved off the upper meadow 17 days early. Look at the wasp nests on the eastern fence line they built 20 feet higher than last year. The animals can read the barometric pattern the same way my father's instruments can. They know the snowpack is going to bury everything below 4,000 feet. She held up the journal. "I have 30 years of data from this specific valley. The pattern I'm seeing right now matches the winter of 1856 in every measurable respect, and in several respects it exceeds it. If we don't begin cutting timber for backup fuel within the next 2 weeks, we will not have another chance. The window is closing." Cornelius set down the pen he had been holding. The patience in his expression had cured into something harder, the way sugar cures into something that no longer resembles what it came from. He was not a cruel man. He was not even in most circumstances a dismissive one. He had built something genuine here, something that had required vision and stubbornness and the willingness to be wrong repeatedly before getting it right, and he had gotten it right. And the thing he had gotten right was standing in front of him in the form of a settlement that had functioned beautifully for 4 years without any input from a teenage girl with a dead man's notebooks. Your father was a capable man. His voice was even. He lived a particular kind of life, and I understand that you learned a great deal from him. But Josiah Calloway died in a cabin with a dirt floor in the spring of a mild-year vesper. The way he lived is not a model I intend for this community to follow. He paused, letting the room absorb this. We have invested in infrastructure because infrastructure is what allows human beings to live above the subsistence level. We trust engineering because engineering can be verified, tested, and improved. We do not make settlement-wide decisions based on the behavior of caterpillars. He gestured to the men near the door. I'd like to continue with Percy's report. Vesper looked around the room. She was thorough about it. She looked at each face in turn, taking her time, the way her father had taught her to read a sky or a tree line, looking for what was actually there rather than what you expected to find. She saw embarrassment in some faces, relief in others, that the disruption was apparently concluding. She saw Eugenia Marsh looking at the floor. She saw Harlan Voss, the settlement's mechanical engineer, looking at a point somewhere between his knees and the middle distance, his jaw tight in a way she could not entirely interpret. She saw Percy Duggan, who was still standing at the front of the room with his agricultural report in his hand, looking at her with an expression she would think about later, not pity, not dismissal, but something that looked almost like discomfort. The expression of a person who has just heard something they cannot immediately refute, but also cannot afford to believe. She closed her father's journal. She walked to the door and let herself out into the September night. The air outside hit her face like cold water. There was something in it that had not been there a month ago, a metallic dryness and edge that did not belong to ordinary autumn. She stood on the step for a moment, breathing it in, cataloging it, the way her father had taught her to catalog everything present, noted, filed. Then she started walking north toward the tree line, toward the storage shed, where she kept her father's instruments, toward the cot in the back room of the great hall, where she would lie awake doing mathematics until she had a number she trusted. The number she arrived at 2 hours later was not a comfortable one. She gave herself one night to sit with it. In the morning, she began. The storage shed held, among other things, 2 heavy canvas tarps that had been used to cover equipment during the construction phase and not touched since. A spare axe with a hickory handle, 3 boxes of framing nails partially used, a spool of heavy-gauge baling wire, a stack of rigid insulation panels made from compressed mineral fiber left over from the boiler room installation and deemed too irregular in shape for any planned use. Vesper did not take all of it at once. She took what she could carry on evenings when the settlement's attention was directed elsewhere, moving through the gap in the fence at the northwestern corner that she had been using as a shortcut for 3 years because it saved 4 minutes off the walk to the creek. The old Hagen trapping post sat in a clearing on the northern edge of the settlement's property at the base of the rimrock that gave the area its name. It had been built somewhere around 1851 by a trapper named Hagen, whose first name nobody had recorded and whose last known location had been a trading post east of the Bighorn Mountains in the winter of 1871. The structure was an A-frame built from old-growth timber logs, 18 inches in diameter. At the base, the kind of wood that took a century to grow and could be expected to take another century to rot, though the chinking between the logs had largely done so. The roof pitched at 60 degrees, which was not an architectural choice so much as a practical one. At that angle, snow does not accumulate. It sheds continuously the way water sheds off a steep roof in rain. The structure had a cast iron potbelly stove with a flue pipe that ran through the peak of the roof and extended 2 feet above the ridgeline. The stove was heavily rusted but intact, the firebox sound, the damper functional, the pipe clear. Vesper had found this out in October of 1885 when she had spent an afternoon exploring the property's northern edge out of the simple restlessness of a 14-year-old with nowhere particular to be. She had noted it then, filed it. She was filing things constantly the way her father had, because you never knew which piece of information would be the one that mattered. The chinking between the logs was her first priority. She mixed her compound from materials the forest provided: clay-heavy soil from the creek bank, dry ash from her test fires in the stove, and sphagnum, moss harvested from the wet ground near the water. The same mixture her father had described in a journal entry from 1868 when he had spent a winter in a fur trader's cabin in the Upper Bighorns. The moss expanded when wet and contracted when dry, filling gaps and sealing them. The clay provided structure. The ash provided thermal mass. She worked from the inside out, pushing the mixture into every gap with her fingers, smoothing it flat, then reinforcing the exterior face with a second application. Her hands cracked by the third day. She kept working. The insulation panels went up on the ceiling, pinned to the roof beams, with the framing nails overlapping at the edges to eliminate thermal bridging. Over them, she stretched the canvas tarps, stapling the edges to the beams, with a technique she had read in the Signal Corps manual, which had devoted 12 pages to the construction of insulated field shelters on the grounds that soldiers who froze to death could not be expected to contribute meaningfully to military operations. The result was a ceiling composed of 3 distinct layers: the original timber, the insulation, and the canvas that functioned as a thermal barrier, substantially more effective than any single component would have been alone. The wood was the work that tested her most deeply. She was not trying to fell living trees. Living trees are heavy, their wood dense with moisture, their weight far beyond what a 15-year-old with a single axe can manage safely. What she was looking for was dead-standing timber lodgepole pines that had died in place, their wood dried from the inside out by years of mountain air, their weight reduced, their fuel quality superior to anything she could have harvested green. Her father's journal called these trees the forest's gift to the careful eye, and described how to identify them: the bark loose or absent, the wood beneath it pale and dry, the branches reduced to brittle sticks. She found them along the northwest ridge, a cluster of 8 trees dead from bark beetle infestation 2 years prior. She spent 10 days felling them, limbing them, cutting them into rounds and splitting the rounds into stove-length pieces with the wedge and maul technique her father had taught her when she was 11. She stacked the split wood inside the cabin along the north and south walls from floor to rafters. The wood served 2 purposes simultaneously: fuel and insulation, a wall of stored energy that also blocked the cold from penetrating the log walls at their most vulnerable points. She set trap lines for small game squirrels, snowshoe hares, using the wire snares her father had diagrammed in his journal, their trigger mechanisms simple enough that they could be reset with cold, stiffened fingers. She dried the meat on wooden racks above the stove, the smoke curing it into a form that would keep without refrigeration through the winter. She gathered pine nuts from fallen cones and dried wild mushrooms on the same racks, alternating them with the meat so that the heat touched everything evenly. She filled 2 wooden barrels with clean snow, which would melt slowly and provide water without requiring her to go outside once the storm buried the door. She also packed one additional barrel with salt-cured squirrel meat pressed in layers under the weight of flat stones, a technique from a journal entry dated February 1862, when Josiah had been snowed in for 6 weeks at a Signal Corps relay post and had rationed for one person across the entire period. His estimate, then 8 weeks at minimum survival intake. Vesper calculated she needed 10 to give herself margin. She worked until she had it. On the 8th of October, Percy Duggan went to inventory the supply shed. He was methodical about it, as he was about most things, working from a list, checking items against their recorded quantities, noting discrepancies. The insulation panels were gone. The spare axe was gone. 2 tarps, the baling wire spool, a significant quantity of nails. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions, but he was a man who had grown up on a farm in Indiana, where tools had specific places and missing tools had specific consequences. And so he followed the drag marks in the mud, because that was the obvious thing to do, and the drag marks led north. He stood in the doorway of the Hagen cabin for a long moment before Vesper acknowledged him. She was patching a remaining gap in the south wall, her back to the door, her arms covered to the elbow in the chinking compound, her movements efficient and unhurried. She had known he was there from the moment his shadow crossed the threshold. "I assumed someone would come eventually," she said without turning around. "I expected it to be Cornelius." Percy looked at the walls of stacked firewood. He looked at the insulated ceiling. He looked at the stove, cleaned and seasoned, its pipe extending through the perfectly sealed roof peak. He was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than most men's moments. "How much of this is from the supply shed? The tarps, the nails, the wire, the insulation panels." She smoothed the section of chinking with her thumb. "I took the axe from the equipment rack by the north greenhouse. It hasn't been used since last spring." "Those are communal property." "Yes." She turned around then. Her face was streaked with clay, her hands blistered under the dried mud. "I know." That evening, the settlement's disciplinary council convened in the Great Hall. They arranged themselves in a horseshoe arc facing the center of the room, the way Vesper imagined courts of law were arranged, though she had never seen a court of law. Cornelius sat at the apex of the arc. Eugenia Marsh sat to his left, her hands folded in her lap. Harlan Voss sat to the right, forearms on knees looking at the floor. Percy had positioned himself slightly outside the arc, which Vesper noted but did not try to interpret. Cornelius laid out the case with the thoroughness of a man who has always understood that the story you tell about an event matters as much as the event itself. Vesper had taken communal property without authorization. She had been spreading alarm among the settlement's children. 3 families had raised this concern directly with him, telling the younger ones that people were going to freeze to death, that the greenhouses would collapse, that the boiler would fail. The combination of theft and destabilization was, he said, incompatible with the principles on which Ashworth Flats had been founded. Vesper did not argue the characterization. "I took the materials because this settlement is walking into a catastrophe with its eyes open and its hands folded." She looked at Harlan Voss when she said the next part. "Someone in this room knows the boiler pump's operating specifications. Someone knows what happens to oil-based lubricants at -25 degrees. I'm asking that person to tell the rest of this council what they know." Harlan Voss did not look up from the floor. The silence stretched. Cornelius broke it. "We have made our decision. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your residential status within the central compound. You will not have access to the communal kitchen, the supply stores, or the medical room. If you find the northern cabin so preferable to the accommodations this settlement has provided, you are welcome to it." He paused. "You will be given 2 days of dry rations. When you are prepared to apologize and accept the community's scientific assessment of our situation, you may petition the council for reinstatement." 2 men walked her to the fence. They did not speak. She did not speak. At the Northwestern Gap, the shortcut she had been using for 3 years. They stopped, and one of them handed her a small cloth bundle that contained hardtack and dried beans, and they turned around and walked back toward the warm light of the settlement without looking at her again. The night air was absolute. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since the council meeting, and the wind had died to nothing, which was its own kind of warning. The held breath quiet of something very large deciding what to do next. Vesper stood at the tree line for a moment. The lights of Ashworth Flats were visible through the gaps in the timber, the great hall's windows lit from within warm, amber rectangles floating in the dark. From somewhere inside, barely audible, the sound of someone playing a fiddle. Friday evening. Someone had started a tradition of Friday music after supper 4 months ago. She had attended twice. She turned north and walked into the trees. The next 3 weeks were the most clarifying of her life. Not because they were the hardest, harder things were coming, but because they reduced everything to its simplest form. Every hour had a purpose. Every action either advanced her survival or didn't. The social texture that normally cushioned the edges of days, the small conversations, the shared meals, the background noise of other people existing nearby, was entirely absent, replaced by the clean, immediate logic of what needed to be done next. She slept when her body required it. She worked when it didn't. She ate the hardtack and beans in careful portions and supplemented them from the first trap line she set on the second morning. On the evening of November 3rd, she stepped out onto the small porch she had constructed from salvaged boards to chop the last log in the exterior pile before moving everything inside. She raised the axe. She stopped. The sky had turned the color of iron that has been left in standing water, a dark, oxidized gray, with a quality of density that made it look less like sky than like ceiling, as if the atmosphere had collapsed downward to a distance of a few hundred feet. The temperature was not simply cold. It was a particular kind of cold that registers in the sinus cavities and the back of the throat before the skin notices it, the cold of air that has traveled a very long way from a place where nothing warm has ever existed. The silence was complete. No wind, no insects, no sound of any living creature in the timber around her. She crossed to the barometer. The mercury had dropped to a level she had only seen documented in her father's written accounts of major storm events, never in her own readings since she had begun taking them at age 10. The needle was at the bottom of its registered range. She looked at it for a long time. She looked up at the iron sky. A single snowflake descended from it with a deliberateness that seemed almost intentional, as if it had been sent ahead to confirm something. It landed on the back of her unwounded hand and did not melt. Down in the valley through the trees, the lights of Ashworth Flats glimmered. The fiddle music drifted up faint and cheerful, a sound from a different world. She listened to it for a moment, the melody recognizable, a reel of some kind, the sort of thing people play when they feel safe. "They are playing music," she said to no one, to the iron sky, to the silent trees, to the barometer that had run out of numbers. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, the same way everything her father had taught her was observation, present, noted, filed. She went inside. She threw the bolt on the door. She crouched in front of the stove and blew the bank coals to life, feeding them first the thin splits, and then as the fire caught the thicker rounds. The iron walls of the stove began to tick as they expanded with heat. She sat on the floor with her back against the warming metal and pulled her father's journal from the cot. She opened it to the winter of 1856. Outside, the wind arrived. It did not build. It simply appeared at full force as if it had been waiting behind a door that someone had just opened. The A-frame shuddered once, a full-body shudder of heavy timber responding to an enormous lateral load, and then it settled into the geometry that had been designed for exactly this. The steep angles deflecting the wind's force upward and outward, the massive old-growth logs absorbing and distributing what remained. The fire in the stove roared as the draft pulled through the flue. Snow hit the sealed windows like thrown gravel, a sound that continued without pause. Vesper turned a page. Her father's handwriting was steady. The letters formed with the unhurried care of a man who is not going anywhere and knows it. Second night of the storm. Barometer unchanged. Temperature inside the cabin 68 degrees. Temperature outside estimated from the behavior of the water in the barrel I left on the porch approximately 40 below zero. The cabin holds. The geometry is not romantic. It is not beautiful. It simply works because it was designed by people who understood that a mountain does not negotiate. She read until the fire needed more wood. She added 3 rounds, adjusted the damper, and sat back down on the floor. The walls of stacked timber that lined the cabin's interior radiated a gentle, stored warmth. The heat from the stove absorbed into the wood and returned, slowly turning the cabin into a thermal battery that maintained its temperature even between feeding cycles. The canvas and insulation ceiling sealed the warm air in and the cold out with an effectiveness that she noted without satisfaction substantially exceeded whatever the copper pipe network was currently managing in the settlement below. She did not feel vindicated. Vindication implies that someone has acknowledged the thing you said. No one had. She felt only the specific peace of a person who has prepared for what is coming and can now do nothing but wait for it. The wind screamed. The A-frame held. The fire burned. Outside in the darkness, in the roaring white somewhere down the valley, where the lights had been, the settlement that $180,000 had built was about to discover what the mountain thought of it. The storm did not peak on the first night. It peaked on the third when the temperature dropped another 12 degrees below what the first night had established as its floor, reaching a sustained negative 42 that no instrument in the settlement had been calibrated to measure. By then, Harlan Voss already knew they were in serious trouble. Though he had known it in the way honest engineers know things they have not yet admitted aloud since approximately 4 hours after the wind first arrived. The boiler room sat in a concrete bunker beneath the great hall, accessible through a heavy wooden trap door in the floor of the storage corridor. Harlan had built his career on understanding systems, the way components related to each other, the way a failure in one part propagated through a network, the way the specifications written in a manufacturer's catalog translated or failed to translate into actual performance under actual conditions. He had designed the Ashworth Flats heating network himself over 6 months of evenings in his house in Cincinnati, using the best data available about Wyoming winter temperatures and the best components available from suppliers in Chicago. He had been proud of it. He had been right to be proud of it as an engineering achievement, in the same way that a ship can be a magnificent engineering achievement, right up until the moment it meets the particular ocean it was not designed for. The pump lubricant was the first thing to go. He was in the boiler room when it happened, not because anyone had sent him there, but because he had stopped sleeping sometime during the second night when the pipe system under the south residential building made a sound like a rifle shot, followed by the particular silence of pressurized water that has found somewhere new to go. He had taken a lamp down through the trap door at 3 in the morning, checked the pressure gauges, checked the pump housing, checked the temperature of the lubricant reservoir with the back of his hand, the way a doctor checks a patient for fever. What he felt was not the warm, slightly tacky resistance of oil doing its job. It was a thick, slow resistance, the resistance of something that has partially surrendered to the cold around it without yet acknowledging the surrender. He went back upstairs. He found Cornelius in the great hall, sitting at the head table with his coat on a lamp burning in front of him, a ledger open to a page he was not reading. Harlan pulled a chair out across from him and sat down. "The pump is going to seize." His voice carried no particular emotion. He had moved past the phase where emotion was useful. "The lubricant is too cold. When the pump seizes, the water in the line stops circulating. When it stops circulating, it cools. At current ambient temperatures, it will freeze within 30 to 40 minutes. When it freezes, it expands. The pipes will rupture at the joints." Cornelius looked at him across the lamp. "How long do we have?" "Until the pump seizes, perhaps 6 hours, perhaps less. I can try banking the boiler higher to generate more heat in the bunker, but the draft is already at maximum capacity." Harlan set his hands flat on the table. "Cornelius, I need to tell you something that I should have said 5 weeks ago in front of the whole settlement." He took a breath. "The girl's numbers were correct. I checked her calculations after the council meeting. I didn't tell anyone because I thought she was still wrong about the severity, and I thought I could manage any problems that arose through the system I'd built. I was wrong about both things." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. Cornelius did not move for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost the practiced quality that normally gave it weight. "How wrong?" "Wrong enough that I don't think we can fix it from inside the system." Harlan looked at his hands. "The system was designed for a worst case of -28 sustained over 72 hours. We are at -42, and the barometric pressure suggests we are not at the peak yet. The worst case I designed for is not this winter's best case." What Cornelius said next, he said quietly, without any of the boardroom authority that had organized 60 people's lives for 4 years. "What do we do?" Harlan had no answer that he was willing to say out loud. He went back down to the boiler room and began doing what engineers do when they cannot solve a problem. He documented it methodically in the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket, recording temperatures and pressures and times, building a record of the failure that no one would read until spring. He was still documenting when at 6:40 in the morning of the storm's third day, the pump seized. The sound it made was not dramatic. A slowing, a grinding, a cessation. The pressure gauge needle dropped. In the pipes beneath the floors of the settlement, the water that had been moving stopped moving. Harlan wrote the time in his notebook. He sat on the concrete floor of the bunker with his back against the boiler casing, which was still warm for now for a while longer, and he thought about Vesper Calloway standing at the back of the great hall with her father's journal, her voice precise and unafraid, and he thought about the expression on her face when she had looked at him specifically, when she had asked in front of everyone that the person in the room who knew the pump's operating specifications speak up. He had looked at the floor. The first pipe joint failed at 7:20. Then another in the north residential wing with a crack that everyone in the building heard clearly, and that produced over the following 2 hours a flood of water beneath the floorboards that froze solid before anyone could address it, lifting the floor plank slightly from beneath as it expanded like something underground trying to get out. By the afternoon of the third day, the residential buildings had been abandoned. Their interiors had dropped to temperatures that made sustained human occupation physically impossible, not uncomfortable, not unpleasant, but physiologically dangerous. The kind of cold that begins converting a living body's resources to the simple project of maintaining a core temperature, drawing heat away from the extremities, first, then working inward with the patient efficiency of something that has all the time in the world. The roofs of 2 residential buildings had failed under the snow load during the third night, the collapses coming without warning, the structures simply surrendering their geometry in the dark while their occupants had already fled. Those who had been inside were fortunate to have left when they did. Those who had delayed lost the option entirely when the doorways buckled and jammed. In the chaos of the storm's peak, 6 people were trapped in the eastern residential wing when its roof came down. They did not survive. This reduced the population converging on the Great Hall from 60 to 54, and then further as the cold worked through the night until 38 people finally pushed through the Great Hall's doors and pulled them shut against the white roaring outside. 38 people converged on the Great Hall, moving through the trenches. They cut between buildings, waist deep in some places where the drifts had consolidated, because the Great Hall was the only structure still standing that had any residual warmth in its walls. The greenhouse failures happened faster than anyone expected because the mechanisms that caused them were invisible until the moment they became catastrophic. Harlan had gone to check the greenhouse status on the storm's second afternoon, moving through the access tunnel that connected the Great Hall to the first greenhouse structure. He had his lamp, he had his notebook. He pushed open the interior door of the greenhouse and stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust. The snow load on the curved glass roof was visible from the inside, as a darkening the light that normally filtered through the panels, reduced to a gray dimness by the depth of accumulation above. The steel frame that supported the glass was a network of curved ribs, each one bolted to the next, at hexagonal junction points, the geometry distributing load across the entire structure so that no single point bore more than its share. This was elegant engineering. It was also engineering that depended entirely on all points in the network remaining functional, because the hexagonal geometry that distributed load efficiently in normal conditions became a catastrophic cascade initiator. The moment one junction failed, the load that had been shared among 6 points now distributed among 5, increasing each remaining point's burden by 20%, which increased the probability of the next failure, which increased the burden on the remaining points further, which was not a problem that stabilized, but one that accelerated. He was examining the northeastern rib cluster when he heard the sound high, fine, sustained, like the note a crystal glass makes when you run a wet finger around its rim, except that it was coming from above him. He looked up. One of the junction bolts in the upper frame was moving. Not much, just enough. Harlan was back through the access door before he had consciously decided to move, pulling it shut behind him when the northeastern quadrant of Greenhouse 1 came down. The sound was not like glass breaking. Glass breaking is a sharp, immediate thing. This was a sustained collapse, the steel frame surrendering its geometry and sequence, each element's failure triggering the next, the glass following the frame down in sheets and fragments that the snow immediately absorbed. The access tunnel shook. Dust or glass powder or both came through the door gap. Then silence. He stood in the tunnel for a moment, breathing. He wrote the time in his notebook. The second greenhouse fell on the morning of the 4th day, while Harlan was in the Great Hall explaining to Cornelius why the first one had fallen. The sound was distinguishable even through the hall's walls, the same sustained quality, the same sequential progression. What followed the sound this time was a scream, because people were in the second greenhouse when it happened. Della Pruitt was 8 years old, small for her age, with the particular self-sufficiency of a child who has grown up in a community of busy adults. Her mother had been sick since the second day of the storm, a fever that had nothing to do with the cold, but had chosen a catastrophically bad moment to arrive confined to a sleeping area in the back of the Great Hall, unable to walk the distance to the food storage in the second greenhouse. Della had volunteered to go. She was the kind of child who volunteered. Harlan had found her at the access tunnel door, pulling it open herself, and had taken her hand because she knew the way better than he did from previous trips. They were in the center of the greenhouse, Harlan loading preserved food into a canvas bag, when the sound began. It was lower than the sound from Greenhouse 1. The frame geometry in the second structure was slightly different. The junction points spaced at wider intervals, which meant the failure initiated more slowly and gave less warning. What Harlan heard was a single metallic groan from the southwest quadrant, followed by the sound of something shifting. His body understood this before his mind did. He grabbed Della's wrist, not her hand, her wrist, the grip that doesn't slip, turned toward the access door and ran. The canvas bag hit the floor. The preserved food scattered across the ground behind them. They were through the door when the roof came down. The force of it pushed the access door outward against Harlan's back, slamming him into the tunnel wall. And then the sound behind them built into something vast, the full weight of accumulated snow on top of the glass giving way, the frame losing its geometry all at once. The whole winter's accumulation dropping 8 feet to the greenhouse floor in a single undifferentiated mass. The tunnel walls shook. Harlan's lamp went out. In the darkness, Della's wrist was still in his hand. She was not screaming. She was not making any sound at all. He felt her breathing, quick, shallow, present. He found the wall with his other hand, relit the lamp with fingers that had begun to shake from something other than cold, turned to look at her. She was looking back at him with an expression that no 8-year-old should have to assemble from available components. It was the expression of someone who has just understood something about the world that they will never be able to understand. She didn't speak. She wouldn't speak, not really, for 2 days. Harlan picked her up and carried her back to the Great Hall. He set her down near the fireplace, which was burning furniture. Now 3 chairs from the dining area had gone in that morning, and someone had started on the bookshelves. The fire was larger than the fireplace was designed to handle the ornamental ironwork around the opening, showing stress marks from the heat. But it was the only source of warmth in a building that was losing temperature at a measurable rate through its large south-facing windows, which were beautiful in summer. In winter, they were 400 square feet of thermal loss glass so cold that touching it left a burn. Cornelius sat in the corner near the fireplace with a blanket around his shoulders. In front of him on the table were his engineering drawings, the original plans for the settlement's heating system unrolled, weighted at the corners with candle holders. He was working through them with a pencil, making annotations, calculating. Harlan watched him for a moment without speaking. What he was seeing was a man engaged in the wrong problem, not the problem of how to survive the next 48 hours, but the engineering problem of where the system had failed, as if understanding the failure would retroactively prevent it. The part of Harlan that was also an engineer recognized this impulse completely. The part of him that had just carried an 8-year-old out of a collapsing structure knew it was a luxury they could not afford. Cornelius, Harlan's voice was level. We need to stop trying to fix what we've built. We need to think about what else is available. Cornelius didn't look up from the drawings. The boiler can be restarted if we can restore the pipe pressure. The pipes are gone. The joints failed in 17 locations. The pipes are solid ice in the walls of buildings that no longer have roofs. Harlan pulled a chair out across from him. I mean, what else is available within reach? Not within the settlement. The room had gone quiet around them. The background noise of 50 people in a shared space reduced by attrition to the background noise of 38 people, some of whom were sleeping, some of whom were managing injuries, some of whom were doing the arithmetic that Harlan was doing and arriving at the same answer. Percy Duggan was not sleeping. He had not slept in a way that counted since the first night when the pipes began to go. He had spent the intervening time doing what came naturally to a man who had learned in the war that the distance between a bad situation getting worse was usually the length of time it took someone to stop waiting for orders. He had organized the furniture burning. He had organized the sleeping rotation so that the weakest people stayed nearest the fire. He had divided the remaining food with a matter-of-fact precision, of someone who has rationed before, not enough, never enough, but distributed equitably, which was what he could control. When the second greenhouse fell, he had been the one to go through the access tunnel with a lamp to assess what, if anything, had survived in the food stores, and what he had found was a frozen tangle of shattered wood and glass and buried provisions that would require days of excavation with proper tools to access. He stood at the wall where the settlement's property map was pinned. His index finger moved across it slowly the way a man moves, a finger across a map, when he is looking for something specific, tracing the property line northward, past the collapsed residential wing, past the ruined greenhouse structures, past the fence line where the storage shed sat half buried in drift, all the way to the notation at the top of the map that read in small handwritten letters, North Rim Rock Old Hagen Structure, to be cleared spring 1885. A project that had never made it to the top of the list, that kept getting deferred in favor of more immediate priorities that sat on the northern edge of the property, unmolested in its original condition, with its original materials, with its 60-degree roof that shed snow. The girl. Percy's voice was quiet. Eugenia Marsh, sitting 3 feet away with Della's head in her lap, looked up. Vesper. She took insulation. She took the axe. She knew about that cabin. He turned from the map. His expression was the expression of a man who has just completed a calculation he does not enjoy but cannot argue with. If she sealed it, if she had time to get enough wood inside before the storm, it's the only structure on this property that was built to survive what's happening outside. She's dead. Harlan said it from across the room flatly because someone had to say what everyone was thinking. We put a 15-year-old girl out in the cold with 2 days of hardtack. The storm hit 2 weeks later. She couldn't have. She took insulation, Percy said again. She took framing nails. She took an axe. She didn't take those things to make herself comfortable for 2 weeks. She took them because she knew exactly how long she needed them for. He pointed at the map at the small notation in the upper corner. The A-frame roof sheds snow. The stove is cast iron. It'll hold heat for hours between loads. If she sealed the chinking gaps with the materials she took, that cabin is warmer right now than this building has been at any point in the last 4 days. The silence that followed was different from previous silences. It had a desperate quality, a quality of people testing the weight of something before they decide whether to step onto it. Cornelius's voice came from the corner, quiet, without any particular inflection. We banished her. She has no reason to let us in. Percy looked at him. The look lasted long enough to carry something that would not have been appropriate to say in front of the remaining children. She has no reason, he agreed. That's true. He began moving toward the supply area where the remnants of their emergency stores were stacked. We're going anyway. 9 people prepared to make the walk. The others, 29 of them, were too injured, too weak, or too committed to the belief that official rescue would arrive to attempt the mile-plus journey through snow, that when Percy pushed the Great Hall's exterior door open for the first time in 4 days, proved to be chest-deep in the areas between natural windbreaks. They made snowshoes from cabinet doors, split lengthwise, lashing the boards to their feet with baling wire, salvaged from the supply room. They wrapped their faces in everything they could find, tablecloths, curtains, strips torn from upholstery. The layers they wore were not designed for this, but layers are layers, and the alternative to inadequate insulation was no insulation. The cold outside was a different order of thing from the cold inside the failing Great Hall. The Great Hall had been inadequate for warmth. The outside was actively hostile to the concept of warmth. An environment where warmth was not a baseline condition, being poorly maintained but an aberration, a deviation from the ambient state that the atmosphere was continuously working to correct. Every degree of heat the body produced was taxed the moment it reached the surface of the skin. The air at -35 did not feel cold in the way that cold is usually experienced. It felt like pressure, a uniform surrounding pressure that pushed inward from all directions simultaneously. Percy led. He used a broken mop handle as a depth probe, pushing it into the snow ahead of each step to find the ground to identify the drifts that might be 4 feet deep versus the drifts that might be 8. The trees offered no shelter. The lodgepole pines along the path were coated in ice to their upper branches, their boughs sagging under loads that had been accumulating for 4 days, occasionally releasing without warning, in small avalanches that fell straight down with a sound like a heavy book dropped on a wood floor. Obadiah Crane was 67 years old. He had been in his professional life a very successful man, financing operations across 3 states' board memberships, a house in Hartford with a conservatory. He had come to Ashworth Flats because his doctor had told him that mountain air would help the circulation problems that had been troubling him for 6 years. The problems that made his hands blue in cold rooms, that made him feel hot when everyone else felt cold, that his doctor had described as a dysfunction of the body's thermal regulation mechanisms without being more specific, because more specific was not something medicine in 1886 could reliably offer. Percy had noticed the symptoms before they left, the way Obadiah kept unbuttoning his coat collar, even in the failing warmth of the great hall, the slightly glassy quality to his eyes, and had considered leaving him behind. But Obadiah had a house in Hartford, a daughter, a life that extended past this valley, and Percy was not yet prepared to make that decision for him. He had been talking continuously since they left the building, not to anyone in particular, not about anything coherent, a low-level verbal stream that Percy had been monitoring with one part of his attention since the second 10 minutes of the walk. He had heard this before. Not often, but once was enough to recognize it. Chickamauga, 1863. A corporal from his unit had marched through the second day of a winter retreat, talking in the same way, a running narration of things that were not happening, in a voice that got quieter rather than louder as the hypothermia took hold. "Artie!" Percy slowed, turned, reached back to grip Obadiah's arm. The older man was moving, but moving without the intention that movement requires, his feet lifting, lifting, a mechanical repetition that was beginning to lose its coordination. His scarf was hanging loose. He had removed his left glove. "Artie, keep your glove on." Obadiah looked at Percy with the pleasant, unfocused expression of someone who has just remembered something mildly amusing. "It's warm," he said in a tone of mild satisfaction. "I hadn't noticed before. It's quite warm." Percy reached for the glove. Obadiah stepped sideways almost gently, as if accommodating a dance partner. "Just for a moment," he said, and sat down in the snow with the same unhurried deliberateness with which a man settles into a chair after a long day, and did not get up again. The next 15 minutes were the worst 15 minutes Percy had experienced since the war, which was saying something specific about their quality. He tried everything he could think of: friction, voice, physical movement. Eugenia turned Della away, pressing the girl's face against her shoulder. The others stood in a loose cluster, not moving, because moving meant accepting what Percy already knew. The mathematics of hypothermia do not negotiate. The core temperature drops below a threshold, the body's systems begin to shut down in a specific sequence, and there is a point past which no external intervention available on a mountain trail in winter can reverse the progression. Percy stood up. He did not look back. "We keep moving." His voice was not cold, but it was finished. "We keep moving, or we die here with him. Those are the choices available." The remaining 8 walked. The clearing where the Hagen cabin should have been visible was indistinguishable from every other snow-covered surface in the Absaroka Range on that particular afternoon. A white, undifferentiated expanse bounded on three sides by timber, broken only by the slight variations in elevation that marked where drifts had accumulated against natural obstacles. There was no cabin. There was no structure. There was a large mound of snow approximately where Percy believed the cabin to be rising perhaps 12 feet above the surrounding surface, its flanks smooth where the wind had polished them, its profile suggesting nothing so much as a natural feature of the landscape. Eugenia's knees went. She didn't fall entirely. She caught herself on one hand, ending up in a half crouch in the snow. And from that position, she made a sound that was not quite a sob, not quite a word, but occupied the register between them, where the human voice goes when it has run out of language for what it is experiencing. Della pressed against her side, said nothing. Percy stood at the edge of the clearing. He did not speak. He was looking at the mound, working from one end to the other with the methodical sweep of a man who has spent a lot of his life looking for things he needed to find. The sun was low, throwing long shadows from the tree line across the snow, and in one of those shadows, at the uppermost point of the mound, something caught the light differently than the snow around it. A surface that was not smooth. A cylinder narrow its color, not the white-gray of compacted snow, but a darker tone, the color of iron that has spent 30 years being rained on. 6 inches of stovepipe above the snow line. From it, barely perceptible against the pale afternoon sky, a thread of smoke so thin it might have been dismissed as wind-disturbed snow dust by anyone who was not looking for exactly this thing. Percy's throat closed. He stood with it for a moment, the sensation of something that had been clenched, releasing the release being its own kind of pain. She kept the fire burning. He said to no one, to all of them, to the iron sky. She's been down there the whole time keeping the fire burning. What happened next was not organized. 8 people in various stages of physical deterioration descended on a 12-foot snowdrift. With their hands with the cabinet door snowshoes, they pulled from their feet with the mop handle, with desperation that is its own form of physical strength. They worked from the apex downward toward the cabin's estimated front face, following the pipe as a compass bearing, digging a channel through snow that had compressed under its own weight into something closer to ice at the lower levels. They heard the bolt before they saw the door, a single metallic sound, not a knock, not a voice, but the specific sound of an iron latch being drawn back from inside, the sound of someone who has been listening to the digging for long enough to know what it means. The door moved inward. Snow cascaded through the gap. From the darkness beyond it, warmth arrived first, not a suggestion of warmth, but a physical presence. A wave of heated air that hit Percy's exposed face like an open hand. Behind the warmth light, the amber glow of a kerosene lamp turned low. Behind the light, a girl standing with her back to the stove, her face composed into an expression that revealed nothing about what she thought of the sight of them. 9 people reduced to 8, frostbitten, half-frozen, arriving at her door with nothing to offer except the proof that she had been right. She looked at Percy. Percy looked at her. In the whole of that exchange, which lasted perhaps 3 seconds, he understood something about the nature of being correct that he had never previously had occasion to understand. That being right when the cost of others being wrong is this high is not a thing that feels like victory. It is a thing that feels like standing in a cleared field after a battle, looking at what the battle cost. There were 30 others, Percy said. His voice was stripped of everything except the information. They stayed in the hall. They believed rescue was coming. Something moved through Vesper's expression briefly, then was gone. She looked past him at the people behind him, at Eugenia, at the silent child, at Harlan, who had not yet met her eyes. Her gaze traveled over each face with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to reading a tree line or a barometer. She was taking inventory. She was noting what she had to work with. She moved to the wood pile. She took 3 sections of lodgepole pine from the stack nearest the door. The wood she had positioned there specifically because it was within arm's reach when the fire needed tending without the luxury of walking across the room. She set them in the stove's firebox with practiced efficiency, adjusted the damper, listened to the draw. The fire accepted the new fuel immediately, the heat output rising to match the cold that had entered with 8 additional bodies. Sit near the stove. Her voice was the voice she had used at the town hall meeting, not loud, not asking. Not touching it, near it. Frostbitten tissue needs gradual rewarming, not direct heat. She crossed to the cot where her father's medical journals were kept alongside the weather notebooks. She found the relevant pages without looking. She had read them enough times that her fingers knew the location. Remove anything wet. If you can't feel your feet, tell me before you try to take the boots off. Harlan Voss had not said a word since entering the cabin. He stood near the wall, taking in the interior, the insulated ceiling, the chinking. He could see she had applied with thoroughness. He recognized as professional. The wood pile that lined 3 walls, the ventilation arrangement at the stovepipe joint where she had sealed every gap except the one that allowed draft. He had been an engineer long enough to recognize engineering. He had been a man long enough to understand what it meant that a 15-year-old girl with a dead man's notebooks had done alone in 3 weeks what he had failed to do with $180,000 of someone else's money. The greenhouse frames, he said finally to the middle distance between himself and the stove. I knew the loading calculations were marginal. I told myself that marginal was acceptable because the worst case I was designing for was based on the historical record, which didn't include anything like this winter. His voice was not seeking absolution. It was the voice of someone completing a record filling in the missing entry. I should have told the council. I should have told you when you asked. Vesper was wrapping Della's feet in the dry cloth she kept folded near the stove. For this purpose, she had prepared for the possibility of treating cold injuries because her father's journal had described treating his own in detail after a hunting trip in 1871 that went wrong. She did not look up from her work. I know you knew, she said. I saw your face when I asked. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of accurate things. Percy sat with his back against the south wall, which was the wall that held the wood stack, and radiated the accumulated warmth of the fire's radiation into the stored timber. He could feel his toes again, which was both a relief and, as circulation returned, a significant source of pain. He watched the girl work, moving between the patients with a prioritization that he recognized as triage, addressing the most critical conditions. First, Della's circulation, a woman named Ruth whose fingers had gone a color that Percy didn't like. A man who had inhaled enough cold air to produce a wet, rattling cough that needed steam to address. She boiled water on the stove's flat top, without being asked, without narrating the purpose, simply moving from need to need, with the focused economy of someone whose mental inventory of available resources matches exactly the problems in front of her. Cornelius Ashworth was not among the 8. Percy had not said this yet. He would have to say it eventually, but not yet. Cornelius had been one of the 29 who stayed in the hall. He had believed with the particular unshakable faith of a man who has always been rescued by the systems he built, that the systems would hold, or that different systems would arrive to replace them. He had been sitting at the table with his engineering drawings when Percy left. He had not looked up. Outside, the temperature at the floor of the Absaroka Valley held at -38. Inside the Hagen cabin, the cast-iron stove built in the decade before the Civil War burned lodgepole pine in a firebox that had been cleaned, seasoned, and adjusted by a 15-year-old girl who had learned to read a mountain the way her father taught her, not by conquering it, but by listening to it until it told her exactly what it intended to do. The fire burned. The walls held. 8 people breathed air that was 68 degrees when outside the same air was trying to kill them. And the difference between those two temperatures was in its entirety, the distance between what Cornelius Ashworth had believed was possible and what Vesper Calloway had quietly without permission made real. The first rule Vesper established was about fire, because fire was the only thing standing between 8 people and the temperature outside, which meant fire was the only thing that mattered. Every 3 hours, someone added wood. Not more, not less. She had calculated the cabin's thermal equilibrium at a specific burn rate, had been maintaining it alone for weeks, knew exactly how many rounds it took to hold 68 degrees against the cold pressing in from every surface. Adding more wood felt generous, but wasted fuel that could not be replaced. Adding less felt cautious, but allowed the cabin temperature to drop in increments that compounded. The mathematics were not flexible. She explained this once on the first night to the assembled 8. She did not explain it again. The second rule was about sleeping positions. She arranged them in rotation around the stove. 2 people close, 2 people at middle distance, 4 people against the walls, rotating every 3 hours, so that no one person accumulated cold in the same position across an entire night. This was not a suggestion. Foster Hayden, who had been a lawyer in Pittsburgh for 20 years, began to object on the grounds that the arrangement near the wall was unacceptably cold. Vesper looked at him with the expression of someone who has already spent time on problems more serious than this one. The wall position is 12 degrees colder than the inner position. You will rotate off the wall in 3 hours. 12 degrees for 3 hours will not kill you. Refusing to follow the rotation could kill the person who takes your place when they have already been in the cold position for 6 hours. She moved to the woodpile. The discussion ended. What she could not arrange by rule was the grief which arrived on the second night without announcement. Eugenia Marsh had been holding herself together with the specific discipline of a woman who has spent a professional lifetime maintaining composure in front of children, because children take their emotional cues from the adults nearest them. She had held it through the walk. She had held it through the door, through the frostbite treatment, through the first night. On the second night, when Della had finally fallen into genuine sleep, not the shallow, shivering doze of the previous hours, but real unconscious rest, her color improving her breathing, even Eugenia's composure dissolved without warning in the particular way of things that have been held under pressure past their structural limit. She wept with the total helpless quality of someone who has no reserves left to moderate the process. The sound she made was not loud, but in a cabin buried 10 feet under snow, with 8 people arranged in close proximity and nowhere to go, it filled the space completely. Several people looked at the floor. Percy looked at Eugenia with the steady, unsentimental attention of a man who has watched people break before and knows that the breaking is necessary before anything else is possible. Vesper was the one who moved. She crossed the cabin, sat down beside Eugenia, and did not touch her, did not speak, did not perform comfort. She simply positioned herself close enough that her presence was unambiguous, close enough that Eugenia could feel the warmth of another person's body in the cold air of the cabin's outer perimeter. She stayed there until the weeping ran out on its own, which took a long time. Then she stood up, added wood to the stove, and went back to her position near the fire. Eugenia watched her cross the room. "I knew," she said to no one in particular, to the cabin at large in the small, stripped voice of someone making a confession they have been composing for weeks. "When you stood up at the meeting, I knew you weren't wrong. I'd watched the elk go. I'd seen the caterpillar you left on the schoolroom table. You left it there for us to see, didn't you?" She stopped. Vesper said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "I didn't speak because Cornelius had already decided, and I had learned that when Cornelius decided something, speaking against it cost more than the benefit justified." Her voice dropped further. "I calculated the cost to myself. I didn't calculate the cost to anyone else." The silence that followed this had a different quality from the silences that had preceded it. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of something said completely a debt named out loud for the first time. Vesper looked at Eugenia from across the stove. That calculation was wrong, she said, not gently, not cruelly, with the same precision she applied to the burn rate, to the insulation, to the trap lines. You'll have to live with that. But you came through the snow with Della. That's also part of the accounting. By the fourth day in the cabin, a structure had emerged among the 8 survivors that none of them had consciously constructed, but all of them had accepted. Vesper was the authority on anything that related to survival, heat, food, medical treatment, structural maintenance of the cabin. Percy was the authority on group dynamics, the thing that happens between people when fear has stripped away all of their social pretenses. Harlan had positioned himself as the person who fixed things, not because anyone asked him to, but because his hands needed something to do that was not sitting with what he knew about the boiler pump, what he had not said at the council meeting. He reseated the stovepipe joint with clay from the supplies she had stored, eliminating a draft she had been compensating for with extra fuel. He reinforced the door hinge with wire after noticing a slight loosening in the upper pin. He did not announce these repairs, he simply made them. The food situation was what it was. Vesper had prepared for one person across 10 weeks at minimum viable intake, enough calories to maintain core temperature, enough margin to accommodate the unexpected. Divided 8 ways, those reserves compressed into something substantially thinner, but they held a shape. She distributed the portions herself each morning without ceremony. A measure of dried mushrooms, a sliver of smoked meat, a small handful of pine nuts for their fat content, and once each week, a spoonful of the salt-cured reserves from the barrel she had packed in layers under flat stones. The deeper stores held back precisely for a situation she had hoped would not arise, but had prepared for anyway. She ate the same portion she gave everyone else, which Percy noticed and which he suspected no one else did, because most people in a survival situation spend their cognitive resources on their own conditions rather than comparative analysis. Foster Hayden tested the system once. On the 5th morning, he pocketed a second portion of the pine nuts while Vesper was treating Ruth's frostbitten fingers. Vesper did not look up from Ruth's hand when she spoke. "Put them back, Mr. Hayden. If you take from someone else's portion, you are making a medical decision for them that you don't have the right to make. Their caloric intake is a health matter, not a preference." Hayden's face moved through several expressions before settling on something resembling shame. He returned the nuts. He did not attempt it again. The fact that she had seen it without appearing to look, that she maintained awareness of the entire cabin's activity while performing close work, was a thing that people stopped noticing consciously, only because the alternative was to think about it constantly. Della recovered faster than anyone expected. Children's bodies in hypothermic situations often do the physiological resilience of youth working in their favor. Though this was not a comfort that Vesper extended as a general observation because Della was not a general case, but a specific child with specific frostbite injuries to 3 toes that required daily treatment. Vesper's father had documented frostbite care with the thoroughness of someone who had treated his own, on more than one occasion, gradual rewarming. No rubbing the application of rendered fat over the affected tissue to protect against further cold damage. The treatment worked. By the 8th day, Della's color had normalized, her circulation had returned to her extremities, and she had begun talking again, first in brief functional sentences, then in the questioning mode that is the natural state of a healthy 8-year-old. "Why does the fire make that sound?" she asked Vesper one evening, referring to the low rhythmic roar of the draft through the firebox. "The stove draws air from the room, heats it in the firebox, then pushes the combustion gases up the flue. The sound is the air moving faster than it wants to." Vesper added a split log, adjusted the damper a quarter turn. "The stove is hungry the same way you are. We give it what it needs, not more. Della considered this. My mother used to say that the mountains were dangerous. Your mother was right. But you live here. Della's voice carried the particular logic of childhood which does not accept contradictions without explanation. Vesper thought about this for a moment, genuinely thought about it, not performing patience. The mountains are dangerous the same way a river is dangerous. You can drown in a river. You can also drink from it, swim in it, run a mill on it. The danger doesn't go away when you learn about the river. You just stop being surprised by it. She closed the stove's loading door. The people in the settlement were surprised. On the 14th day, the food reserves crossed the threshold that Vesper had identified as the point requiring action. Not empty, there were still enough supplies for another 2 weeks at reduced portions, but reduced below the margin she had established, as the buffer against the unexpected, the buffer she had already spent once when 8 people arrived instead of 1. She had been recalculating, daily running the numbers in her father's journal margins, and the numbers had been patient about delivering the same answer, regardless of how many times she ran them. She told Percy on a Tuesday evening quietly while the others were in their sleeping rotation, "We need to go back to the settlement." Percy was quiet for a moment, which was his way of confirming that he had already reached the same conclusion. The concrete storage bunker under the hall was intact when I last saw it. The cold in that building since the boiler failed means the wax-sealed tins and preserved goods in the bunker will still be viable. If the structure didn't collapse completely, there's food down there that could take us through to March. Percy looked at his hands, which had healed better than she'd expected. What about fuel? She indicated the dwindling woodpile with a slight movement of her chin. The hall's furniture, the floor planks from the residential buildings, if anything is still standing. Oak tables burn for hours. It won't be enough on its own, but combined with what we have left here, it might close the gap. Percy nodded once slowly, with the minimal motion of a man conserving energy for what he already knew the next day was going to demand. They left at first light on the 24th of January. The temperature had moderated from the impossible depths of the storm's peak to a sustained -20, which was cold enough to be lethal, but cold in a way that the body could meet for a defined period of time with adequate preparation. Percy carried the axe. Harlan pulled the sled they had constructed from the cabin's small table, the surface wide enough to carry a significant load. Vesper watched them go from the doorway. She could not leave the remaining 6 unattended, with a fire that required management watching, until the timber absorbed them, until the sound of their snowshoes was indistinguishable from the general silence of a frozen valley. She closed the door. She went back to the stove. The walk down to Ashworth Flats took Percy Duggan 3 hours, which was longer than the summer walk by a factor of 9, which told you something specific about what the storm had done to the landscape it had passed through. The trail he had walked dozens of times in the previous 4 years was not a trail. It was an undifferentiated white surface in which the natural features that had previously served as landmarks, a particular boulder, a gap in the tree line, the slight rise before the fence had either disappeared under accumulation or been so transformed by the weight of snow on surrounding vegetation that they were unrecognizable. He navigated by the sun's position, by the inclination of the slope underfoot, by the 30-year-old memory of terrain that had been given to him by the war, which had required him to move across broken ground in the dark, in weather, under conditions that punished inattention, with consequences that made current frostbite risk seem moderate. Harlan did not speak during the descent. Percy did not require him to. What remained of Ashworth Flats settlement was a series of mounds, some regular where the geometric structures beneath had maintained enough of their shape to influence the snow surface. Others irregular where the collapse had been complete. The Great Hall's footprint was identifiable because the walls, though breached in 2 places, were still partially standing in the timber framing, having withstood what the glass and steel greenhouse structures had not. Percy recognized this without pleasure. The timber had done what timber does. The engineering marvels had done what overspecified systems do when they encounter conditions outside their design envelope. The roof had partially collapsed inward, which meant the entry required excavation. They dug for 2 hours, working from the exterior wall inward, carving a channel through compacted snow and fallen timber until they reached the threshold of what had been the main entrance. Harlan went first because he was smaller through the shoulders. Percy followed, ducking under a collapsed beam that had arrested its fall against the wall and created a low passage into the interior space. The cold inside the hall was the same as the cold outside. There was no difference, no residual warmth, nothing to distinguish an interior from an exterior, except the walls, which provided a windbreak that the open air did not. What the walls enclosed was a frozen record of what 30 people do when hope runs out in sequence rather than all at once. The layers of effort visible in the arrangement of the space. The furniture burned progressively. The remaining pieces moved closer to the fireplace in stages. The bedding concentrated in a shrinking circle around the dead hearth. 30 people. Percy counted them without wanting to. The way you count things, you cannot stop yourself from counting. They were arranged in the way that people arrange themselves when they understand that warmth is a shared resource, close together, overlapping the larger bodies on the outside and the smaller ones toward the center, an instinctive configuration that had come too late to matter. The cold had done the rest with the impersonal thoroughness that cold applies to everything. Cornelius Ashworth was in the corner. Percy had expected to find him at the head table with his drawings in the posture of a man engaged in problem-solving. What he found instead was a man who had moved from the table to the corner at some point, perhaps when the fire finally went out, perhaps earlier, and sat down against the wall with his back straight and his coat buttoned to the collar. His hands were in his lap. In his right hand he held a pencil. His left hand was resting on a sheet of paper that had been folded twice, and then unfolded as if he had made a decision to put it away, then changed his mind. Percy crouched down. He picked up the paper. It was the boiler system schematic, the original engineering drawing, the one Cornelius had been annotating in the final days. The margins were dense with calculations, corrections, revised specifications, the record of a mind that had continued working the problem past the point where working the problem could do any good. At the top right corner of the page, in pencil in handwriting that was smaller than Cornelius's usual hand, cramped in a way that suggested it had been written with stiffening fingers. V. Calloway was right, I was not. God forgive my certainty. Odd. Harlan was standing behind Percy. Percy heard his breathing change when he read the words over Percy's shoulder. Percy folded the paper carefully with the deliberate, respectful motion of someone handling a document of consequence. He put it in the inner pocket of his coat against his chest, where it would stay warm enough not to become brittle. He stood. "Storage bunker," he said. His voice was level. There was nothing in it that was not necessary. The bunker hatch was under 3 inches of ice that had formed when the burst pipes flooded the subfloor and froze. They chipped through it with the axe working in relay, the sound of the axe on ice, carrying through the silent hall in a way that felt wrong, too loud, too industrial, too present in a space that had become something else. The hatch opened. The bunker below was dark, cold, dry. The concrete had held. Whatever force had brought the ceiling down had translated through the structure in a way that left the subterranean space intact. And in that space, wax-sealed tins of beans, salt pork cured in brine and packed in crockery, dried rice sealed under cloth and pressed wax. The settlement's emergency food reserve that had been stocked for a scenario that had turned out to be in the end not an emergency scenario, but a funeral one. They loaded the sled methodically. Harlan found in the far corner of the bunker 3 links of heavy oak from a broken cabinet that had been stored there for repair. They tied these to the sled's underframe because oak burns long. Percy found 4 wool blankets in a storage chest that had survived the collapse by being against the concrete wall. He took them. They did not speak while they worked. There was nothing to say that the work itself did not say more precisely. The return trip took 4 hours because the sled was heavy. They reached the North Rimrock clearing in the last hour of the afternoon light, the low January sun cutting hard shadows across the snow. Percy stopped at the edge of the clearing, breathing hard, his body having spent everything it had on the descent, and the excavation borrowing now against reserves that were not refilling. He looked at the snow mound, at the stovepipe, at the thin thread of smoke still rising from it. She had kept the fire burning while they were gone. Of course she had. He found the rope they had used to mark the tunnel entrance and followed it down to the door. He knocked twice. The bolt drew immediately. She had been listening. The door opened. The warmth that came through the gap was not a surprise anymore, but it was still, after 4 hours in -20, the most specific relief he had ever experienced. "We found the bunker," Percy said. "Enough food for 6 weeks at full portions." He began moving the supplies through the door, handing them to Harlan, who stacked them along the east wall. 30 people in the hall. None of them survived. His voice delivered this the same way he delivered everything, with the minimum inflection necessary to convey the fact. He had learned in the war that a fact stated flatly is more survivable than a fact stated with the weight of its implications attached. The implications would arrive on their own. They didn't need accompaniment. Vesper received this information without visible reaction, which Percy had come to understand was not the same as receiving it without effect. She was quiet for a moment. Then she took the tins and began organizing them by caloric density, arranging the highest value items at the front of the supply area where they could be accessed with minimum heat loss from the door. Whatever she was doing with what Percy had told her, she was doing it somewhere below the operational surface, in the place where she processed things that couldn't be addressed by a task. Ruth, who had been listening from near the stove, made a sound. Not words, a sound. The involuntary sound of a piece of news landing on a person who was too depleted to absorb it correctly. Percy crossed to her and sat down beside her, not saying anything, applying the same method he had seen Vesper apply to Eugenia on the second night. Presence, not comfort. Proximity, not resolution. February arrived without ceremony. The temperature outside moderated to a sustained -15, which was cold enough to maintain the snowpack at its full depth, but cold in a way that the cabin's fire managed without the knife-edge precision of the storm's worst days. The supplies from the bunker, combined with what remained of Vesper's original stores, produced a diet that was monotonous, insufficient for satisfaction, sufficient for survival. People adapted to monotony with varying speeds. Della adapted, fastest, approaching each meal with the equanimity of someone whose primary experience of food is as fuel rather than pleasure. Foster Hayden adapted, slowest, spending the first 2 weeks of February, describing with diminishing enthusiasm as the audience's patience diminished meals he had eaten in Pittsburgh restaurants. The weeks produced their own texture. Eugenia continued teaching Della in the evenings, using the almanac pages as reading material, moving through the weather tables with the methodical patience she had applied for 15 years to the instruction of children who did not necessarily want to learn. Della proved to be an excellent student. She had her own reasons for learning the almanac, not the tables themselves, but the system behind them. The idea that information about the world could be recorded in a form that someone else could read and use. She asked Vesper one afternoon if she could see her father's journals. Vesper considered this for a moment. She took the journal from the cot and opened it to a page in the middle, not the first page, not the last. A page from the winter of 1871. Josiah's account of a 3-week stretch of severe cold, during which he had maintained his observation schedule without interruption, recording temperatures and pressures and wind speeds with the same discipline at -30 as at +40. Della read slowly, her finger moving under each word, her lips shaping the syllables. Vesper watched her read, and her expression in that moment was the closest thing to unguarded that Percy had seen on her face in all the weeks they had shared the space. "Your father was careful," Della said, looking up from the journal. "He was precise," Vesper answered. "Careful implies hesitation. He wasn't hesitant. He just didn't leave things out." She took the journal back with both hands, the way you hold something that has weight beyond its physical mass. "He said once that the only honest response to a mountain is to pay full attention to it. Not partial attention. Not attention qualified by what you hope the mountain is doing. full attention to what it's actually doing. She paused. Most people only pay the kind of attention that confirms what they already believe. Percy understood, sitting against the warm wall of the cabin that Vesper had built with stolen materials and her father's knowledge, and 3 weeks of solitary labor, that this was not a statement about Josiah Calloway or about the weather. It was the thesis of the entire winter, offered without ceremony to an 8-year-old girl who might carry it forward into a life that still had most of its length ahead of it. He wrote it in the part of himself where he kept things worth keeping. On the 3rd of March, 1887, something changed in the air pressure. Vesper noted it on the barometer at 5 in the morning when she rose for the first fire tending of the day. The mercury, which had been stable at its winter position for weeks, had moved not much, not dramatically, but in the direction that her father's journals associated with Pacific air moving inland. The warmer moisture flow that indicated a blocking system was dissolving. She took the reading 3 times to confirm it was not instrument variation. Each time the same result. She wrote the reading in the journal margin next to the date next to her father's reading from the same week in 1857, when the winter of 1856 had finally broken. The numbers matched almost exactly. She did not wake anyone. She put the journal down. She added wood to the fire, adjusted the damper, sat on the floor with her back against the warm iron. Outside, above 10 feet of snow, above the stovepipe, above the frozen canopy of the Absaroka Range, something was beginning to move in the upper atmosphere. Something large and slow. The reversal of the same mechanism that had set the winter in motion 6 months ago. She couldn't feel it from inside the cabin. She knew it was happening because her father had taught her that you can know a thing is true before you can perceive it directly, if you have learned to read the instruments honestly. She sat with that knowledge until the fire needed more wood. Then she added wood because that was what the next hour required. The warming took 11 days to become undeniable at ground level. 11 days during which the temperature rose in increments so gradual that on any single day the change was barely perceptible, but across which the cumulative movement was from -15 to -5 to +12, a trajectory that produced by the 14th of March a quality of afternoon sunlight that carried actual warmth rather than merely the appearance of it. The snowpack did not recede. Snow accumulated over 4 months does not recede in a week, but its surface changed, developing the slight glistening crust of freeze-thaw cycling that meant the process had begun. On the 15th of March, Percy heard something. He was outside the cabin. They had begun taking brief outdoor intervals as the temperature became survivable for short periods because the vitamin deficiency and the confinement were producing physical symptoms that fresh air partially addressed. He was standing at the tunnel entrance, breathing air that was 12 degrees above zero, which felt, after months of comparison against much worse, almost temperate. He heard the sound before he could identify it. Rhythmic. The pattern of feet lifting high to clear a surface, setting down with the particular compression of shod hooves on crusted snow. More than one animal. More than 4. He went back down the tunnel at speed. "Someone's coming from the south," he said. Vesper was already at the barometer. She looked up. The road from Graybull Station runs along the South Ridge. If the temperature has been breaking for 2 weeks, the lower elevations may be passable. She was calculating the timeline as she spoke, working backward from current conditions. A party could have left Graybull 10 days ago if they had the right equipment. The horses reached the North Rimrock clearing at mid-morning. Percy heard them stop. Heard voices, 2 or 3 of them, the words not yet distinguishable through the snow. Then a single voice, louder, directed at the snowfield rather than at a companion. "Hello, anyone alive in this valley?" Percy put his mouth near the tunnel vent. "Down here," he called. "There are 8 of us. We need the tunnel cleared from the top. It's collapsed at the upper end." A long pause. Then the voice again, closer now, at the tunnel entrance overhead. "Sweet Lord in heaven, you're under the snow." Marshal Calhoun Briggs of the Wyoming Territory had left Graybull Station on the 4th of March with 12 men, 3 pack horses carrying supplies, and an expectation that he was riding toward a recovery operation rather than a rescue. The telegraph's silence from Ashworth Flats had persisted since November. 4 months of silence from a settlement of 60 people in the worst winter in territorial memory said something specific about the odds of finding anyone alive, and Briggs had made his peace with those odds somewhere around the second day of riding. He had brought supplies anyway because Briggs was the kind of man who brought supplies even when he expected not to need them. It took his team 40 minutes to clear the tunnel entrance and excavate a passage wide enough to move people through. Percy came out first, blinking in the March sunlight with an involuntary full-body flinch at the brightness. Then Harlan, then Ruth, then Eugenia with Della, then the remaining three adults, each one emerging into the light with the blinking, slightly disoriented quality of people returning from somewhere that has no windows. Vesper came out last. She stood in the snow in the clearing outside the cabin she had built from a dead man's post and a living man's knowledge in the March sunlight of the Wyoming Absaroka at the end of the worst winter in 40 years, with her father's journal in her hands and a canvas bag over one shoulder. She looked at Marshal Briggs's 12 men and their horses, at the equipment and the supplies, at the whole organized apparatus of a rescue conducted by people who had ridden through manageable cold toward a place they expected to find silent. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, fully, precisely, without committing to an interpretation before the inventory was complete. Briggs dismounted. He was a tall man, weathered in the specific way of people who work outdoors in Wyoming, with a face that had been rearranged by wind and season into something that communicated competence before any words were exchanged. He looked at Vesper with the expression of a man who has been told something in the last 10 minutes that he is still in the process of believing. Percy had gotten to him first in the minutes between the tunnel being cleared and Vesper emerging, and had given him the essential facts: 60 people in the settlement at the beginning of November. 8 survivors, 1 structure standing. All surviving people had spent the winter in a cabin prepared by a 15-year-old girl whose warnings had been formally ignored by the community she had tried to save. Briggs held out his hand. Vesper looked at it for a moment, then took it. His grip was brief, professional, the handshake of someone who respects rather than condescends. Miss Calloway. He had apparently decided on formality, which was the right decision. I'm told you kept 8 people alive through the hardest winter this territory has recorded since statehood. Vesper released his hand. 7. One of the 8 didn't make it on the walk over. She didn't elaborate. Obadiah Crane's location was already filed in her inventory of things to report when the time for comprehensive accounting arrived. Percy handed Briggs the folded paper from his inner coat pocket. He watched the marshal read it, watched the marshal's expression move through several registers. Professional assessment. Something more than that, something that involved the lines around his eyes tightening in a way that was not entirely attributable to the cold. Briggs refolded the paper, held it for a moment, looked at Percy. This stays with the record. That's why I kept it. Briggs's team worked through the afternoon assessing the settlement site, documenting what they found, doing the grim, systematic work that comes after disasters, when the disaster is over and the living must account for the dead. Vesper sat on a supply crate at the edge of the clearing and watched them work. She ate the food Briggs's cook produced from the pack supplies. Real food cooked over a real camp stove, hot, in a way that was different from the emergency heat of the survival months, without rushing, without the rationing calculation running behind her eyes for the first time since November. Della sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. The girl was not speaking, not asking questions, simply present in the afternoon sunlight, with the unself-conscious ease of someone who has decided that proximity to a particular person constitutes safety. Vesper allowed this. After a while, she opened her father's journal to no particular page. A random interior page, one of the hundreds of entries from the years before she was born. Josiah Calloway recording temperatures at a post in the Absaroka Range that no one had thought worth maintaining, accumulating evidence for a pattern that no one had asked him to document. She ran her thumb down the column of numbers. The handwriting was small, consistent, the work of someone who was not performing the record, but simply keeping it because the record was its own justification. 3 weeks later, a reporter from the Cheyenne Daily Sun arrived at the North Rim Rock clearing on a horse that showed evidence of having been pushed harder than was kind. He was young, ambitious in the way that manifests as slightly too many questions delivered too quickly, wearing a wool coat that was adequate for Cheyenne in March, but had not been designed for the elevation. He dismounted in front of the cabin Vesper had returned to it after the rescue team departed because it was the place her supplies were, because it was structurally sound, because she had not yet received a better offer, and introduced himself with the practiced energy of someone who knows that access to a particular person depends on making a good first impression. Vesper was sitting on the porch steps she had built in October with the barometer in her lap taking the morning reading. She listened to his introduction. She did not adjust her expression to indicate that she found it impressive. "I don't have anything to tell you that the marshal's report doesn't already say," she told him. "If you've read the report, you know what happened." "The report is facts," the reporter said in the tone of someone explaining the difference between ingredients and a meal. "What I want is the story, how you knew, how it felt, how a 15-year-old girl—" He caught something in her expression and course-corrected. "How you managed to survive when 60 people with $180,000 in infrastructure, and the absolute confidence that they had correctly understood their situation." Vesper said without sharpness, without bitterness, with the flat exactness of someone correcting a measurement. She looked at the barometer. The mercury was at a position that indicated continued warming Pacific air, still flowing in the winter, releasing its hold on the Absaroka in the same slow, unstoppable way it had seized it. They weren't stupid people. They weren't careless people. They were people who trusted the things they had built more than they trusted the information coming from outside the things they had built. She paused. "My father spent 20 years keeping records that no one asked for. He kept them because the mountain didn't care whether anyone was asking. The mountain was going to do what it was going to do, and someone should be paying attention." The reporter wrote rapidly in his notebook, the pencil moving with the focused urgency of someone who recognizes that what they are hearing is not going to be repeated in this form. "What would you say is the lesson if you had to—" "I wouldn't have to." She looked up from the barometer, looked at the reporter directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "Lessons are for people who believe the same situation won't recur. This situation will recur. Some version of it recurs every generation. People with sufficient resources deciding that their resources have purchased them an exemption from conditions that don't negotiate." She looked back at the clearing at the tree line at the ridge above it, where the snowpack was visibly diminishing in the March warmth, the mountain returning slowly to the form it wore in the other seasons, the form that would be mistaken by the next group of people who came with money and plans for permanence. The mountain isn't a lesson, it's a fact. It will be a fact whether or not anyone learns anything from this winter. The reporter stopped writing. He was looking at her with an expression that was not what he had brought with him when he rode up. Not the professional curiosity of someone collecting a story, but something more personal, something that involved reconsidering the angle from which he had approached the entire morning. "What will you do?" he asked, and this question was different from his previous ones. It was not a reporter's question. It was the question of someone who has just understood that the person sitting in front of him is not a subject, but a fact in her own right, the way the mountains above them were facts. Vesper stood up from the porch step. She put the barometer inside the cabin door in the place she kept it, the same place her father had kept it in his own cabin, at a height that allowed the reading to be taken without bending at an angle that protected it from direct sunlight. She picked up her father's journal from the shelf beside the door. She looked at the date in the upper corner of the current page, March 1887, then at the date in the corresponding entry in the journal's interior. the same week in 1857, when the winter of 1856 had finally relinquished its hold on the Absaroka. "I'll keep the record," she said. "Someone should." She went inside. She closed the door. The reporter sat on his horse in the clearing for a long time, long enough that the animal shifted its weight and blew a slow breath into the cold air. He looked at the cabin door. Then he looked up at the Absaroka Range above the clearing, at the snow-covered peaks that did not look like a threat from this distance, that looked in the clear March light like something permanent and indifferent, something that had been present before any of them arrived and would remain after all of them were gone. He looked at the mountains the way he had not looked at them when he rode into the valley, not as backdrop, not as scenery, but as the primary fact of the landscape, the thing around which everything else was merely arranged. In the clearing below him, at the edge of the tree line, where the snowpack was thinnest, and the ground had begun to accept the warmth of the lengthening days, a small yellow flower had opened in the mud beside a protruding knuckle of rock. It was the first flower of the season. It had arrived on its own schedule, indifferent to what the winter had done, following the same instruction it had always followed: when the conditions are right, grow. The reporter looked at it for a moment. Then he turned his horse south toward Grable Station, toward the telegraph office, toward the story he would spend the rest of his career trying to tell accurately. Behind him from the cabin, the thin thread of smoke from the stovepipe continued its quiet rise into the cold blue air, steady as a pulse, patient as the mountains themselves.